kept us going on our last leg. So this is our 24th session that we've done. So we're coming up to the last two. And we thought we would go back for two different reasons. One, we have a real intent. Last leg. So this is I'm hearing myself. Sorry about that. We have a real intent to make sure that we're a truly global guild. And I think we've talked to a number of our Australian colleagues and well, I'll get to it at the end of the presentation, but we do have a special thing around Australia over the summer months this year. But we also wanted to, on the heels of an election that just happened, I do think this may be a canary in the coal mine about Australian elections being a portend to the world. Australia has a very unique situation unto itself. It straddles, this trade issue between China and the Western world. It straddles COVID. It treated COVID very differently, and it had some wins and some losses doing that. It straddles the climate disasters that we faced in a much different way. It's a fairly arid continent with a fragile environment on its coasts. There's so many interesting strategic conundrums, certainly for the new Labour government that's come into Australia, that I thought it was appropriate that maybe we spend some time looking at disruptive Australia. So any thoughts, opening perspective on this, Rob? And I know we're waiting for a few more people to come in, maybe from Australia, but any thoughts on what's mentioned so far?
Yeah, as part of the vision to the world, I think from our perspective, in the cycle of these global events that have been happening across the last 2 years, pandemic through to populist governments, we're watching all these elections harder and add in conflict. It makes it important for every part of the world where the leaders are looking. So I certainly was keeping an eye on this election to see what the result would be, and then waiting for some of the more detailed analysis people to share with us on the ground and learn more about it. But I was not surprised and surprised, I guess.
Yeah, no, it's funny, like Australia politics, from what I understand, I know some people that work in Canberra, it's a blood sport, right? You barely get to live out your whole term because either your own party or somebody else will swallow you whole. So I liken it a little bit to American politics in some respects, but you don't even get to serve out your 4 years at times. Some of my Australian friends may even correct me on that if that's the case. So I've got 3 or 4 slides to set this whole thing up around, okay, high level, what are we looking at disruption wise, and what's the unique Australian take on this? So I'll go through that. And then my hope is we can have a chat with some of the Australians that have joined us to see what unique perspective they have on it. So this is a global thing that the conference board did. They said, what are the major disruptions in 2022 that are facing CEOs, which isn't fully reflective of a country, but when you have a good cross-section of CEOs, it's probably what countries are thinking of too. No surprises on this list. The labor and skill shortage is something that we've all seen. Mass resignation, the big quit, whatever you want to talk about. I know there are people on my street that can't get just basic products. There's a whole bunch of people that have moved in on our street, can't get a fridge, right? They have to wait 6 months for a new fridge to show up. And so that's a challenge. The pandemic, we're still in it. I think Australia is uniquely affected, particularly somebody had mentioned to me about one of the big big holes in tourism and travel this year is China and Japan are still in pretty much lockdown. And so, you might have travel returning from most parts of the other world, but what was the biggest chunk of travelers in the world? They were coming from China pre-pandemic. And so how does that affect Australia uniquely? Supply chain disruptions. Australia is a continent unto itself. I'm really curious to hear from Australians firsthand how supply chains being disrupted is affecting them. Financial markets and inflation, and being a more of a commodity-based economy. There are some wider ramifications there in terms of when gas goes up or when other things go up. Cyber risk, yes, and making enemies, whether it's Russia or China or whoever across the world, has some associated challenge with it from a cyber standpoint. My Lord, this is quite topical. Geopolitical instability. You're still a democracy, which is good, but you've just had a turnover in government. I'm curious to know what some of the driving reasons were, according to some of our people coming in today. Polarization. I'm not too sure how polarized Australia is, but I think pretty much the world is polarized. Crises of trust and natural disasters, which I know last summer, or I guess winter in our world, but Australia's summer, there was a number of very threatening and natural disasters.
Hey, Sean, what's an example of a crisis of trust?
Don't trust the media. I mean, I guess you've seen the Edelman trust barometer, right? Like, do we actually trust our media in the pandemic? Do we trust science? Do we trust CEOs? Can we actually, believe what they say they are and trust that they'll do the right thing in times of moral quandary? Would be my kind of interpretation.
I'm kind of wishing that people put that higher on the list and there'd be less on the top of the list.
You got a really
imagine that,
good,
right?
You got a really good point there, because I mean, I'll state that maybe they're all well-meaning people, but they know that the key thing that's going to drive their performance is something else. But there is a slide here I've got on ESG, and if you look at the top 10 issues that CEOs are facing, a lot of the ESG issues are not reflected in that. So we might still be in the days of trying to convince people that more than the bottom line is more than the bottom line. These were the external factors and internal factors. Similarly, not too many surprises there that people were facing. Once again, on an internal basis, talent and transformation; on an external basis, disruptions, inflation, and labor, with a few other things sprinkled in. As I mentioned, the ESG social priorities, looking at equality, labor conditions, gender, public health, human rights, and racial equality in a ranked order. It is higher on people's agenda. I'm just curious to know how much teeth people are really putting into it. And then finally, I looked at globally where people have ranked all these issues. And Australia is a weird one because there wasn't an Australia breakout. And in some respects, I think Australia lines up very well with US and Europe sentiments, but just even geography wise, they're probably more lined up with China and Japanese sentiments. So it's, I'm conflicted on what anybody from Australia would say would be our top issue to our new government needs to chase after. So looking for unique Australian takes in this session. Don't need anything too disciplined or prescriptive. This is, we like to keep these things conversational, and I'll mention that a little bit later. So I'm going to go off screen. I think we've got a couple people here from Australia. Any thoughts? I know, well, Rob, I'll give it back to you, and then we can devolve to discussion.
Well, welcome, Wendy. Good to see you again. Alice is off screen right now, and then Vikash joining us. Thank you for joining. How are you, and good afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon. Good afternoon, Rob, Sean. Nice to see you guys again.
Really good seeing you. So give us firsthand. You've just had an election. You've gone through the rigmarole of a blood sport that's the Australian political scene. What's your first outtakes from that?
My view, and I was talking about it with a work colleague this afternoon, just as you do late in the day, not quite glass of wine in hand. I think it's just waiting for the dust to settle a little bit. No one was really surprised there was a change of government. ScoMo might have been, but so, there's a lot of startup that happens at the beginning of a government sort of taking power. And, we still haven't got our 76th seat settled yet. So that's an artifact of a lot of people voting early with poll votes, postal votes, and pre-poll voting, which changes the landscape of how quickly they know results. So, one first thing is, can the Labor Party govern in its own right, or is it going to need to court independence? And there's a whole lot more independence now, and a sort of third party forming. So I'm no political pundit, I'm not a political player, but most of us are sort of just watching what's forming up a little bit. And then I guess when things really start, which, give it a week or two, there'll be more resources and more decisions, but everyone sort of jostles a little around deciding where they want to put their own energy and looking for other people, and those people declaring what they're going to do in the next 3 years, really. I mean, there's a lot of money floating around that is potentially hidden in different places. Little slush funds for this or that needs to be discovered. And then there's a lot of players who are, could be philanthropists, who are backing particular directions to do with sustainability and various forms of, resource management and Indigenous values. And yeah, it's a feast. You got to look at it with a bit of humor, I think.
I love it. And Vikash, you're like in Perth, so maybe there's a different sentiment even cross country. I think you're in Perth. You'll correct me otherwise, but
yeah, I mean, I'm still plan to go back to Perth in a month or so, but I've been completely updated with that. So I'll put in the Western Australia perspective a bit, and then the sentiment, right? I think a couple of things which you put on that chart in terms of the key areas troubling Australia. I think they are bang on. The first one, the skill shortage and everything else, right? I mean, that's been top of the agenda. Most of the CEOs have made that very vocal. Specifically in Western Australia, I've seen with most of the mining and oil and gas clients I service, most of the CEOs have made that comment that, this whole policy around the restrictions, borders, and everything else, the way it has been handled, it has completely put them in a very different pedestal. And they were even planning to shift either to Eastern Australia or even shift the core business part outside of Australia, right? I mean, it had come to that level because they were really getting challenged by the whole, overall on an Australia level, the policies. And second, specifically the Western Australia Premier and the decisions he was making, right? So that has been really, top issue that I've seen in the past. And the second is, which I'm personally facing in most of the projects and programs I'm driving with my clients, it's the whole supply chain disruption that has happened. So either you talk about getting few people who are getting transitioned to Australia. So I'm getting a couple of new skilled people from South Africa or UK. And they are telling me that earlier the usual shipping companies, like you have this Telno Logistics and all, which is one of the main logistics provider. They were charging $1,000 to $1,500 for a container, like 40 feet standard size, and now it has gone 10 times basically, right? And there is no regulation because they are not registered in Australia; they're registered in Panama or some other countries basically. So there is no way you can regulate that, and they are it's becoming a cartel of sorts, and that's adding to the whole supply chain woes. So that's on the personnel movement and the luggage and everything else. But on the other hand, let's say for things which I'm doing something for oil and gas clients or mining clients, so even to ship any kind of OT equipment, semiconductors, if that is required, hardware elements. Earlier it used to take like 15 to 18 days, roughly. Now it's going into 6 months time period, which is like crazy,
wow.
right? So I've started to see, earlier it was for me, it was more a part of discussions and debates and all, but now I'm feeling it firsthand. So, it's very real, all these challenges. And I'm looking forward to see how some of the actions the new government will take is gonna hit these, pressing issues on head.
Well, I think a lot of these issues are sort of unevenly seen, like depends on the industry you're in. Some of them are just not observable unless you're in a particular place and you have particular knowledge. So, to the average punter out there on the street, they'll see gaps in, a supermarket, things that they'd normally expect to get that there's an alternative for. It's not perfect, but it's not as if the shelves are bare. But, you know, there are things that are really quite problematic, which are, you know, building supplies, and that delays a lot of things. And, you know, if you say your economy runs on housing, and it's always been a big driver, then those put all sorts of pressures in the system, and they pop out in lots of different ways. So it's not as if you'd come to Australia and see nothing on the supermarket shelves and all the shops shut. A lot of these are really complex issues, and, you know, supply chain issues. They have their source overseas. They're not something you can just sort of, you know, say we're going to fix this and magically, you know, it's all gone back to the way it was. And in truth, in some ways, you don't actually want it to go back to the way it was either. You know, it's a time where people are actually looking for meaningful change in various directions, and just going back to BAU seems to be selling out a different sort of future. So I think there are a lot of people who don't mind the disruption because it gives new opportunities, you know, to operate under a more ethical framework, or to do business with different countries, or to, you know, take a step back and not run a fast and furious life if that's what you choose to do that as a community. I think I loved seeing that during COVID. It was one of the better parts of COVID, you know, people spending time together. So it's not all doom and gloom, you know. I think there's a decent amount of, well, you know, hope for something that's a little bit quirky. Australia's good at quirky. We're good at naming our opportunities and just going behind the scenes a little bit and creating some new ones. Why not? It's how we've won a few things in international arenas and things like that. You know, not by not listening to the master and just going off and doing it. Makes you a bit
I would be
creative.
inclined to agree. As one of the British colonies, so I'm hailing from Canada. As we kind of look at this, we have a similar orientation, but a very different one, right? I mean, we're similar sized countries. We have the same colonial backgrounds here, but with the similar issues around indigenous things and being a commodity economy, and how do we sophisticate ourselves away from it. But you're in a very unique position in Australia, like no other country. And I'll give Australia a really backhanded compliment, I guess, because you faced down China about a year and a half ago and said, yeah, we don't like your human rights, and we're going to talk about it in whatever places we want to. And then they slap so many different tariffs on you that you probably can't buy a bottle of Wolf Blass wine in China, which might not have hurt your economy. It sounds like it didn't hurt your economy. You found different markets for your products, which I guess has flummoxed China to no end, because they would, I think they wanted to penalize your economy for speaking out on human rights. Is there, so I guess the question I might have is the future ambition of Australia. Do you have a point of view in terms of whether it tilts west or whether it tilts east?
I don't know. I think you'll probably have a pretty firm idea. And from where we've got a lot of Asian students who've passed through our household over the last 5, 7, 10 years, and they're looking westward for different opportunities. And I would have said, you know, 5, 10 years ago, or certainly 5, it was definitely looking east and locally for more opportunities. And now I think there's just a lot more distrust, or certainly a lot more analysis around, you've got to be careful what you wish for. And also there's, you know, I think there's a real shift in the knowledge of dependency. Like if you depend on one particular solution, this having, you know, many different ways in which you could run your future is really important. So constraints make you think twice about relying on one particular direction. So I'd say east-ish now. Certainly more local, because, you know, we all need to be, you know, if you look at what's happening around the South China Sea and such, you know, no one wins by being blind to some of these things as they happen. Nobody wants confrontation either. You know, you look at what's happening in Ukraine, you need to stay in negotiation with people. So at the moment, I think there's Penny Wong's wandering around that region, and her equivalent from China is wandering around that region. And it'd be very interesting to hear the specific conversations they're having around, being sovereign and keeping the peace in the region and making sure that no one dominates in one particular way, and looking after local needs, being a good neighbour. So I don't know, Eastwards perhaps, but not solidly east. Vikash?
Yeah, no, I think probably you just had an interesting point, Van, and I completely agree with what you mentioned, right? I think the point around one is a self-reliance part. That's something which I'm strongly seeing, right? I mean, in terms of even that whole skill shortage aspect. So there is a big focus around the learning and development and growing, skills indigenously within Australia. So you kind of not continue to make that, dependency on the whole pipeline of people, coming from different parts of the country and still filling in those skill sets. You start home growing, and I've seen a lot of job IDs now getting added to the whole ANZESCO list now, which is a reflection of the same. On the other part, I think if you see, even though that's a focus, you cannot, avoid the fact that this is a connected world, right? So the dependency on the different countries will still be there. For an example, Australia's full agriculture and food produce exports that happen, right? 70% of that is absorbed by Asia, right? And typically, if you talk about it's South Korea, China, the likes of that, right? So that will still be there, and I think there'll be this dependency around eastward dependency always, with a bit of the traditional native dependency or alignment with West, which will continue. But I think Australia will go more balanced and a bit more inward focus as well now. That's what I see.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot more drive, and there has been for more than 3 years. It happened before COVID, to have a lot more manufacturing on site. If you've got the materials and such, we used to have it, and then as trade opened up, it was more about the global trade situation, and then when the borders close and you're not got that international movement of people, but products still move, the relationships get degraded and supply chains become a problem. Then you start thinking, oh, well, we should be making this at home. Oh, that's right, we can do this, can't we? So there was a lot of just scrambling to retask things during COVID, and it just makes it really obvious you need those constraints. I guess the point I'd like to make more than anything else is that whenever you've got a constraint, it makes you come up with creative solutions, and Australians are really good at that. And it's good to see that having been energized over the COVID years. And I think that people are taking a bit more of that seriously now as things warm up again. It's not like, oh, okay, let's do it exactly the way we were doing it before. But it takes time to turn those things back. And I think a lot of Australians are sort of, with COVID again, some people got stranded overseas. Some people wanted to leave Australia but couldn't. Some people were perfectly happy being here because it was a pretty straightforward place to be. Even if you were in Melbourne, it was a lot more straightforward than a lot of other places. And if you get sick, you've got a decent chance of care. So we've got it pretty good, really. We can't complain. I think that would be wrong. We've just got a different set of problems, and every country has its own set of problems. And we're pretty multinational, which I'm proud of. It just gives you more insights, and we've got a decent number of resources. My hope is that we don't just sell them to other people and not process them here. I think it's more important to develop that capacity.
Yeah, I think we share a little bit of that sentiment in Canada too, with this big elephant to the south of us called the US, and we've kind of realized in COVID, we can produce some of this stuff. And then your thought about supply chains, but also technology, right? I think the long-term trend was, why do we put all of our raw materials on a ship, send them halfway across the world, and then send them back to us refined, when the technology might be there to do it locally without big refineries or big kind of use of people And plus we've seen the environmental impact of sending all that stuff around the world too. So yeah, it's
And,
I think a
and
lot of
if
countries
it's
may be
over there
struggling with that.
processed, the chances are that it's going to wait over there and get processed into something, so the manufacturing goes with where the products go to get refined, and before you know it, you see you have to buy everything in except for the raw materials that you have and you're not using locally. So that's it's just one of those questions that you're going to answer when you've had the pain of seeing what happens when things stop flowing the way they used to and you didn't notice. I think that there's a lot of really interesting projects coming out of the Australian government. One of them was the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment. So if you just take the idea of water, you can export water just in products. If you use the water to grow apples here and you export the apples or the watermelon, you're actually exporting water, which is a quite interesting thought. It's called virtual water. That's the phrase for it. Now, Australia's a pretty dry place.
Yeah,
well,
no,
except for when the floods are going on. Yes, I know there's been floods, but there's been a lot of, in general, it's a dry place. There are periods when it's quite wet in some parts of Australia. But my point is virtual water is a really interesting concept. For a dry continent, exporting things that are grown with water, exporting is almost the same as exporting water. So
yeah,
water moves around the planet.
You're tapping into my old laundry detergent marketing days where it's like we tried to do all these things called ultra and got all the water out of it, right? Like, what's the point of sending water around the world? I'm going to entertain me for 2 minutes on this subject because I surfaced this as a potential trend globally this year that has some Australian wrinkle to it. So this year is the Queen's Jubilee. We've I think she's been 70 years around. It just feels like the Queen was going to be around forever until she got into her recent health spates. I thought this woman was going to live to be 150 or something. India and Pakistan are coming up to their 75th and 100, or I think 75th. Maybe Pakistan might be a little bit ahead of independence. The Commonwealth Games are this summer, which oftentimes brings together kind of thoughts around, what is our connection to this Commonwealth thing? And we've had some recent Caribbean island nations go, yeah, we'd like to make ties go off altogether. And the fact, even as a Canadian, I stare at the Australian flag going, wow, they still have the Union Jack on it. That's crazy. But maybe it isn't. So wade into this debacle of a debate. Is there any more sentiments around, let's become something that isn't a Commonwealth nation or some version of that discussion going on in Australia this year?
It's not a big one at the moment. I think it's going to turn up again. Historically, it's really hard to get something across in a referendum. The cards are stacked up against you. And sometimes there are some major players who are just not on board for that, and you've got to pick your fights. I don't think at the moment it's top of mind. Yeah. When we have King Charles, people will talk about it more, but it costs a lot of money to make a decision like that. And I guess to a certain extent, you could say if it's not broken, don't try and fix it. I think there probably is some brokenness around it, but when people have got the COVID and then all the, the establishing a new government and things like that. Yes, it would give a sort of mark. We are the government that managed to get X across the line. But if you had to choose the things you want to accomplish, I don't think that would be the top in terms of actually making the country work. I think it's something that will happen somewhere between 5 and 20 years. I think it will happen. I think it's inevitable that it will happen.
Lukash, anything to add on top of that?
I think we have seen countries. Country called the last one. I think that was one of the Caribbean ones, maybe. Who they broke away from the monarchy, out of monarchy, right? So I think there are countries. Realizing the kind of the setup or the constitutional setup in which they need to work. I think it has more and more becoming symbolic. Under which flag you operate, it is more symbolic. I think most of the countries, including Australia, they kind of it's again symbolic, right? I mean, Australia is very much embedded into the whole concept of democracy and the way the constitution is. So I think they will shift away from this whole symbolism also and adopt in this whole modern world wherein you're talking more, inclusive governments, which are connected, which are part of all these groups. Like in Australia, we just had this Australia and Japan and the others, the Quad meeting that just happened, right? Wherein more important decisions are being made. So monarchy has specifically from a Commonwealth perspective, there is nothing kind of being shoved down the throat of all these countries. They are taking their independent decisions. And this will fade away, as Wendy mentioned as well. I think, I don't know in what timeline, but I think probably 5 to 10 years, I see this kind of getting slowly rooted away, and each country will have a very specific, distinct personality of itself. So,
I think there's also an interesting trend that's happening in Australia in that Indigenous people are starting to really be active across the whole of the country in just about every realm, as doctors and as politicians and as people who are running companies and as people who are trained academics and decorated for being academics and really stellar thinkers, scientists, the whole lot. And what's happening is sort of like being in a Commonwealth, especially when there's a lot of bad vibes around what that's meant for Indigenous people. And I'm not trying to speak for Indigenous people. My family's from Wales, so they're sort of expats and part of a diaspora, if you like, displaced in another way. But I think what's happening now is a rationality that goes with that says, is it really relevant to have the people who colonized Australia as, the links there just don't seem to be so coherent anymore. And the other part of the rise of people who are First Nations people, to use the Canadian term, but Indigenous Australians, is that it's an us thing now. It's not the way it was, 20 or 30 years ago. It's sort of like, let's all rise together. There's difficult things that we all have to do, and it has to be done together and with all the other people who've joined Australia. And so it's hard, but I think we're getting some of it better gradually. And I can't see that supporting a monarchy is part of that, really, or coming, as an, you're going to change your politics to meet that. I just can't see the two things being consistent over time. Someone's got to call that and change it.
Very interesting. I'm about to sneeze, so that's why I'm like delaying whether I should make a question or sneeze first. It's one of those ones that you have to sneeze. It's a question of when. I think I'm good for a question here. Environmental impact. So Australia tends to be on the front line of a lot of different things, whether it's your coral reefs and trying to protect things, or native species that can only be found in Australia, or the extreme heat of your summers and what look like a complete apocalypse that look like Mad Max in previous your summers. What's the is there a 2 or 3 year view in terms of how serious do we get? And even if Australia gets serious about things, you're living in a global world. So butterfly flaps his wings around one side of the world, it affects Australia. Like, is there a feeling of helplessness there? What's the sentiment around things that have, at least from my Canadian lens, have looked atrocious over the last 2 or 3 years?
Well, I've got a question for Vikash, because a lot of those things didn't happen in Western Australia, and know that I spent 20 years in Western Australia. So my kids were both born there. So, I mean, you've had fires recently, but you didn't have the big floods, and you didn't have the triple whammy, and you didn't have COVID in quite the same way. So it's sort of a lot of business as usual. And my daughter lives there, so lots of friends who live there. So, in terms of disasters and such, that is just normal, the way it is in Australia. It's a place that's hot. But what do you think? I mean, Is it
Yeah,
is
I
it
think
strictly a one way?
well, I think, I mean, again, word on the street, right? I mean, people do say that it's getting hotter compared to, last 10 years and all. People are always comparing, but I've seen that in every country I've stayed in earlier, right? So, it's a standard comment which people make, and I think it's standard, which basically holds for the whole planet at this point of time. But having said that, I think, yeah, I mean, Western Australia has been fortunate in that sense that, the amount of disasters we faced was relatively lesser. Um, you know, but I think on the other hand, when it comes to the environmental impact, right, I think and Western Australia, the biggest industry representation is all this resources. You'll see, there were a lot of hue and cry around recently, one of the mining giants, right, Rio Tinto. They had this new site being developed, and then they completely destroyed one of the aboriginal sites, basically, right? Unintentionally, but that was the cost of development, and that caused a lot of uproar, and the focus back on the ethics of the business, what we do in Australia and how these companies should operate and all those kind of things, right? So that's I've seen that there's been a lot of focus when it comes to environmental impact and what the kind of these larger businesses are trying to commit to, but at the end, on ground level, are they following these ethics or not? And then Australia as a whole, because I've been very closely related with the whole sustainability and the ESG groups within Australia, especially in Western Australia, with my firm and the ecosystem that it has. I mean, there was a goal of Australia reducing 26 to 30% of its GHG emissions, which was there in 2005. By 2030, right? And that's a pretty ambitious target. And I feel it's making all the right steps as well. And there's a lot of focus. I think every conversation that I have with any business at this point of time, irrespective of which area are we discussing on, sustainability features, right? Inclusion and diversity features. I'm bringing in the First Nations inclusion and everything else at a workplace as well. When the whole discussion we were having earlier. So inclusion and diversity and sustainability has been two constant topics in all sorts of conversation, and people are now not doing it for the face value, but they're actually engaging, they're actually raising genuine points. So I've seen that real shift right now.
I think it's definitely part of every conversation. I don't think that people who truly want to make change suddenly or gradually work their way into understanding how interdependent all the different things are. So the one example that I would give that has come up in the newspapers only within the last week was if you want to go to renewable resources, that mean you need batteries. You've got to have the heavy metals. You've got to have the special metals that you need to be able to make those, and they're under precious pieces of bush somewhere, and you've got to make a choice. You either have the more sustainable power sources, or you have the bush. So you can't have it both ways. So if you're campaigning for the sustainable and renewables, you're going to make sacrifices, and the logic is you're going to make sacrifices and destroy more natural habitat. And this is another really important point, that a lot of the rules that set up who owns what, you might have your land and the house that sits on the land, and sometimes you lease the land in some parts of Australia, but you don't own the water as it falls from the sky. Well, in theory, nobody owns it then. It lands on a piece of land. It's not yours, really. You can't keep all of that. There's rainwater and water harvesting and floodplain harvesting going on in New South Wales, and they're trying to work out how to deal with that. And then when things are under the ground, they're actually owned by the government as well. So, it's not as easy as saying, I don't want you to mine X, because they actually own X, and you don't have a right necessarily to stop X coming out of the ground. And to get it out of the ground might mean that you have to move, or the environment that you're in is so changed that you don't want to be there. And, it looks like that those sorts of things don't change quickly, and the habits that sustain them are, you know, people who net worth individuals who've got in the ability to earn even more money by, you know, harvesting resources. The money just tends to drift more and more into the same hands. So it'll be really interesting to see if there's a will to change those sorts of not just policies but laws, because they really shape the country.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And I'll just add two more in the same context. I read a very interesting article from HBR earlier that what if the mining companies in Australia stop mining today, right?
Yeah.
What will happen? How will the world look like? And it's a very interesting and long article, just got me hooked, right? And I just read through it, and it basically says that you simply can't stop mining with all this hullabaloo around the whole mining, that, you know, it has to be sustainable, it's creating a load on the environment and everything else. Because even if you shift to renewable energies, right? Solar energy, you take that example, right? Where are you going to store the energy? You need batteries for that. For batteries, you need conductors. For conductors, you need nickel. You need aluminum. You need lead, right? That will, again, you'll have to mine for that. So what you can do is you can, you know, do mining a bit differently and consciously and ethically. You can do precision mining and all those things, but mining as such is not going away. It's going to stay, and it's there at least for 100, 200 years, if not more. And the second interesting fact is this whole focus around solar energy in Australia is, like, you know, on top of the list when it comes to the focus on solar energy, right? And hydrogen and everything else. Now, if you see, 1 in every 5 Aussies, and probably that number might have changed, have solar panels on their roofs, right? That's the statistics. But only 5% of the entire Australian population have actual batteries which are storing that, energy that is being absorbed. So there is a big, disbalance between how it's is currently happening, and there is a good focus around solar energy in Australia. And I think it would be nice to see how the focus on renewables and the good balance with the traditional resourcing industries can, work together and, make it a more practical and pragmatic approach, rather than, just thinking in silos, or having some viewpoint which is just good for discussion but not practically.
There's a sort of sideways point which comes in with governance, and it also fits in with trustworthiness and such, is a lot of things can get approved through backdoor routes. Somebody sponsors someone, buys something somewhere in the system. You hope it doesn't happen, and everyone knows that it does. And so, while there's good actors there's a lot of ways of just, if it didn't quite work out, if your environmental regeneration plan didn't quite work out and you can't quite return the land to anything like it was, and there's a lot of pollution there's always another way to go and get to another patch and do more of what you just did. And I'll call it hearsay, but I've heard it from a friend of mine in WA that, with mining in one part in the northern part of Western Australia, it's quite easily seen that remediation is not a possibility, but there's a lot more of what they just took out of the ground in another patch. And you can always ask to get another mine up and going, keep the industry going. You never really have to deal with the cleanup, because it's a big country and there's another source, and you just have to oil the right hands. That's mixing my metaphors, but it's in every government, there's always these sorts of behaviours, and that happened. Oh, so sorry, it won't happen again. It does.
I see what you mean. Yep.
It's not corruption in the same way that it happens in other places, but it's definitely there. So the new government, in theory, is going to be looking at corruption at a government level. I don't think that happened beautifully in New South Wales. We know people who were really treated badly, honest people who were treated badly. So it's not easy to do, and it's expensive. But I think accountability is one thing that people are looking for.
My apologies. I couldn't hear what you said.
So accountability and transparency and following up with some of the core promises. So I think we're going to see a bit more care, hopefully, about disadvantaged groups. Hopefully we'll see.
I know we're
rebalance.
coming up close to the end of our stuff, but I have three quickie questions for you guys. I'd love to hear a little bit about the technology scene. I know both of you guys wade into the technology area. I kind of view Australia oftentimes with a little bit of envy as well. You've got some interesting projects going on. I know from an autonomous vehicle standpoint, I know there's stuff going on in your country. I know obviously climate is such a big deal that you've got climate technologies. And where else was I going with this? I had heard something else that is now, oh, well, no, just I think about different things that bubble up. I look at Canva as something that came out of your country. I look at some of the sharing economy stuff, some of the first things like 99 Designs and a few other companies came out of Australia. What's the thing on the frontier? What am I going to hear about next coming out of Australia?
It's a lot of blockchain and DAOs, and there's a lot of activity in that area. And a lot of it is aimed for positive change, but it's not all that. Vikash, is this your area? I mean, I know a lot of people who are deeply into technology. There's a strong cybernetics pool at ANU trying to counter the worst parts of the technology and to try and get more humans involved in the design. And that was, if you like, a refugee from Silicon Valley. I don't think Genevieve Bell would think of herself as a refugee, but she left Silicon Valley having spent there a long time there as an Australian, and came back wanting to mitigate some of the impacts of technology that she sees are going to be challenging. So there's a counter move as well as a forwards move.
Yeah, and I'll agree, right? So, I mean, if you just see technology-wise, the whole Gartner hype cycle, right? I mean, it's a year-on-year basis, and a lot of focus has been on some of the. I'll now start calling them not new technologies, but like traditional technologies now, because it's been there for a while. Like the whole focus on autonomy and remote operations, which I've seen. I'm personally involved in a couple of big projects with the mining firms on autonomous haulage and everything else in the Gudavari area. The whole autonomous operation in terms of sitting in Perth, they're able to kind of manage the whole mine site, right? And you have like a big control room. It's really coming straight off your Jetsons movie. And when you have focus on, like Melly mentioned, I think blockchain is really picking up now. This whole cryptocurrency focus and all those things. I think no country is able to now ignore that. So the whole then you have this decentralized finance DeFi, the shoot off concept. The one interesting one which is getting a lot of focus right now is the focus back on people and the environment and all, which is around the whole metaverse concept, right? So I know firms now, they are basically launching their own metaverse instance. When they induct people, onboard people, train people, they're doing that in metaverse, and most of these leading companies have started to do that now. So that's something which I've also seen, taking a lot of focus. And the last one is any technology that's helping in this whole circular economy concept, and blockchain again features there very strongly. So and 3D printing and blockchain. So 3D printing basically, print stuff at the source, right? Minimize waste, those kind of concepts. And blockchain is basically the whole transaction and the chain of custody and everything else. So that's helping that whole sustainability and circular economy concepts around what Australia is focusing on. So yeah, that will be my current take.
I think adding to that, some of them are direct response to COVID. So 3D printing, for example, was benefiting from the fact that if we can't ship it in, we can print it, and also people being more remote to their health services. I think virtual medicine and virtual hospitals have really come up to the fore. Simulation is another area that fits in with education. So augmented reality, and that can fit in with diversity training. It can fit in with orientation. It can fit in with experiencing design and contributing to design processes, and gaming and things like that. There's a really big sort of gaming industry in Australia. A lot of smart kids go into that, and then they get hired into areas where drones are a really big area in Australia. I think area of development in Australia, because you've got that and how it ties in with agriculture and managing wildlife and stock and I think something was delivered. Oh, that's right, an AED was delivered to somebody, and then the ambulance followed. You drop the AED in, and then the people come. But if somebody knows CPR, so you can just see it's not delivering coffee. So there's lots of little weird things that go on, even in my local area. You're thinking, oh, that's a great application. Some of them are direct responses to needs that have come out of COVID, where you couldn't get what you wanted, so you just did it a different way. So it's always interesting. I don't think that these patterns are necessarily just to be declared one way. I think depending on where you come from, you see a different cut of them. Who there's always an inside story, though, isn't there, Vikash? It's always someone from inside the company that says,
do some insider trading there. Yeah.
Well, not even just that. I think it's just that, the reality doesn't necessarily match the hype. And so, it's the same old story. You've got to sell it. But whether it's actually as good as it seems is always an interesting thing. Sometimes the jury's out, really, isn't it? So maybe the jury's out on our current government. In 9 years or 6 years or 3 years' time, we'll be having a different conversation. But I guess we're up for a bit of change, hey? Nothing like a bit of disruption to have some fun.
Always. All right, quickie for you. Quickie for you. It was prominent in February of this year, so I'll have to ask the question, even though it's 10 years in the future in Australia. 2032 Brisbane Olympics. Good, bad, indifferent? People are worried. People feel like they've got a big price tag ahead of them. People feel like it's a great platform for national pride.
I think that if you're in Brizzy and if you're in real estate, you care a whole lot. If you're training athletes in Australia, and in particular in that region, you care a whole lot because you're planning, that amount of time. Canberra, it's not really cracking much of a mention, really. And it's not bad, bad vibes or anything. It's just, we've got other things to deal with, I think, in the short term. So the excitement will come. I was there for Sydney. Our kids were little. I took them there. It was interesting to see the world come. And Brisbane's got a very interesting profile. It's not flat. So it's going to be very interesting to see, but it's a very pretty place. My daughter loves living there. So hopefully, we'll have the time and the calm approach to building and doing what needs to be done to do a great job. They did a great job in Sydney, so Brizzy should be really good.
That's a good encapsulation. My sister just moved back to Brisbane. And yes, she experienced the real estate ride of Brisbane in a penalizing way. So, Vikash, anything about the Olympics before I get at my last question?
No, I think Shiru said it, but I think it's all good, right? It's all a very positive vibe around that. Always to basically be the host. That always instills a sense of pride, right? That it's an international event, and anything you host internationally, it basically showcases a country's ability to basically, connect to the rest of the world. And, that's the time, Australia is in super focus.
I think if you're coming back to Canberra, its role there often is supporting the athletes early enough for them to really be on top of the game by the time you get to the year of the Olympics. So you've got the Australian Institute of Sports, and you've got all the scientists at the universities, and you've got all the decision makers around sporting programs. And there's a lot of pre-work that's done, not just 2 or 3 years out. It's a huge amount of planning and resourcing. So, everyone will be there in some format, even if it's moving out of town, so somebody else from another country can come in and enjoy some of the beautiful Brisbane landscape. It'll be good fun.
That could be it. I'll go to my sister's house and she'll tell me that she won't be there during the Olympics because she's rented her thing out for Airbnb too much. All right. We called this whole session Disruptive Australia. We got about a couple minutes left. Give me your best 45 seconds. We'll start with Vikash. Give me your best 45 seconds in terms of how is Australia going to disrupt the world? What's, whatever soapbox you want to be on.
I think Australia is going to disrupt the world with more indigenous homegrown businesses and startups. I guess that's the future. I think there will be very niche startups that will emerge in Australia that will lead the way for the rest of the world. I think that's the very key part which I see. The second one, I think it's in the whole renewable energy space. I think the kind of strides Australia is making there, it's going to become a template for the rest of the world to follow as well. So that will be my quick two key pointers in terms of how Australia is going to disrupt.
What my cut here is, I'm hoping that the rise of Indigenous people in Australia and the need to look after the environment becomes a useful sort of counterfoil to Australia just being a big mine and a big place to ship things out. There's a lot of value in the country that really should be maintained. And so that's a wish for, and I think it's starting to be recognised as attention that has to be managed. And I don't think we've mentioned space. Australia's got, I'm talking about, space and, rockets and launching
the final frontier space.
Internet of Things, and joining up, the knowledge bases across all the different systems so we can actually see what we're doing with our land and our people, and how that supply to other places isn't costing the future of the land and people, because you've got to keep on keeping on. It's the infinite game. It's about making sure that we always have something to trade forwards with, and Australians are pretty good at doing that across time.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, both of you. I feel much more educated about a place that's halfway around the world, but I feel a special connection to Australia with my sister being there and being in similar environments country-wise. I just wanted to mention in closing that our featured guild city in July will actually be Sydney, and magically it's happened for all of our featured guild cities. The moment we do stuff, we have a town hall later in the year or later in the month, you magically become part of the top 10 cities of our guild. So I suspect we'll have a real recruitment effort in Australia over the next month and a half. And so hopefully some of your colleagues will join us there. We've got an event around play in summer. We have an event in the fall around book club, and then we will redo our 1,000-day radar in winter. And so those are three big linchpin events that we'll be doing as well. So to both of you, thank you so much for updating us on this area. You've done Australia proud, and hopefully this is one of your last job functions of the week. Hopefully you'll enjoy a really good, I guess, wintry weekend. Is the weather cold there? It can't be cold. It's never cold in Australia.
It's Canberra, it's cold. In Perth, it's not. Perth gets 45 degrees, but not today.
No, not today. Well, I thank you. This is like our 24th leg. So we're all like kind of hemorrhaging on a little bit of coffee energy or an early morning coffee energy, but we've now about to migrate into the last session. You're welcome to stay with us. We're just kind of doing a cast back and a cast forward to what's happened on the day of the Swan and what's ahead. So I'll give it back to Rob again. I've given him a little bit of relief in this segment. Rob, take us home. We'll first of all shut down this session, and we'll be airing these videos over the next couple of days. Yeah, 24th session done.